Okay. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Olivia Issa. I'm the co-chair of the steering committee for Student Voices for Refugees Network through University Alliance for Refugees and At-Risk Migrants. And Iman, I know you're on the steering committee doing some work with Working Group too, but if you'd like to introduce yourself outside of that context where you are now, feel free.
Sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Iman. I'm a third-year law student at UCLA Law. I'm also the founder of the Refugee Student Scholarship Program, which provides scholarships to refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers who are either admitted to or continuing at a University of California or California State University campus. So I'm excited to be here.
So exciting. Thanks so much, Iman. And I've heard a bit about your program. And from what I remember, you were at UC Irvine and you saw a gap in the ability for resettled refugees or folks in the states who had experienced displacement weren't able to access college spaces as easy as the others at school. And so you had pursued a grant. Was it $6,000?
Yeah, so it was called the Dalai Lama Scholarship at the University of California, Irvine. So they would provide $6,000 to students who were launching a compassion and action project. That's what they called it. So my proposal was the Refugee Student Scholarship Program.
And you used that $6,000 to turn it into a lot more money, right? Through a grant, right. Through a gala.
Yeah.
How much?
So we held a fundraising dinner in November 2017. And using the $6,000, to fund the entire fundraising gala, and we were able to raise close to $100,000 at that event.
That's amazing. And how long did that $100,000 last you?
So what's incredible is that it's still lasting.
Okay.
So that's something we can get into as well through this conversation. I think part of the reason why the Refugee Student Scholarship Program is limited to assisting refugees and asylees and asylum seekers at the University of California and California State University campuses is because both UCs and CSUs are public administrations, public university institutions. And so the idea is that most refugees and especially asylum seekers, they're going to be attending community college first. A lot of times they do that not only for the financial benefit of being able to transfer and attending a UC or CSU for 2 years, but also because they kind of want exposure to the higher education system in the United States first. So having that option ends up being really good for them. And then when they are ultimately able to transfer to a UC or CSU, as I mentioned, they only have to attend for 2 years. And once they have that background attending a community college, then they're also able to qualify for in-state resident tuition, which is significantly cheaper in public universities than out-of-state tuition or even the tuition at private universities. So just for some comparison, at the University of California, if you qualify for in-state resident tuition, that ends up being around $15,000 annually, whereas out-of-state tuition or private university tuition can be up to like $50,000 or $60,000 annually. And because, as I mentioned, we raised close to $100,000, our scholarship seeks to provide up to $10,000 to University of California recipients and up to $5,000 to CSU recipients, just depending on their financial need and the amount of funds that we have. And it's because of that, $10,000, say for like an asylum seeker who needs to otherwise pay $15,000 a year, ends up having a huge impact. Whereas, a $10,000 wouldn't have much of an impact on like a $60,000 a year tuition. So that was the idea.
That makes so much sense. And I appreciate you explaining that. And I do want to dig into that. So to clarify, the audience of who these scholarships are being provided for are folks who are already in community college, where you say, we will provide the scholarship if you complete 2 years of community college on your own, or when do people apply?
And so, yeah, we're not specifically targeting community college students. It's open to anyone, like I said, admitted to or continuing at a UC or CSU. Some of them are first years, but we found that especially for asylum seekers, many of them were on the community college to UC or to CSU path anyway to begin with. And so we've thought that having a system like this in which that we'd only have to provide scholarships to them for 2 years instead of 4 years ends up having more of an impact. And that way we're able to support them throughout their higher education career versus, just providing them with scholarship for 1 year or a semester.
I love that. Okay, that makes sense. So then on, I think the biggest question that was brought up among SBR and that I've been grappling with in my head as well is like negotiating with universities, because I do feel like that can be, fundraising and finding funding is hard, but getting faculty on board and administrators on board seems really daunting to me. So it seems like this process doesn't impact the university admissions process because it's for students already in these universities. But beyond that, I mean, I imagine there is still some communication with universities, or how does that work negotiating?
Yeah. So, in fact, when I started first calling on the University of California to join the International Institute of Education Syria Consortium of Higher Education in Crisis, even before I established the Refugee Student Scholarship Program and before we did all the fundraising, our initial goal was to get the university, the entire UC system, to join this consortium and to allocate seats for refugees and asylum seekers. And our goal was maybe to have the University of California, maybe per campus, allocate 1 to 2 seats for refugee students to cover the cost of their, give them a full ride essentially. And then also make it such that if they allocate seats, then only students of refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds would have to compete for those seats, thereby making it easier for them, because obviously it's very hard for refugee students to compete with other college-bound students, right? Refugee students frequently, they have gaps in their education. They might not be able to get their resumes. They might have gaps in their resumes. They might not be able to get their transcripts, and they might not have the resources to prepare for entrance exams. So that's why the initial idea was to create just to have seats allocated for them. But then when I spoke to the UC Regents, I learned that, especially in 2017, when I was really getting into this and when I was able to meet with them directly, that it would be pretty much impossible for the University of California to join the IIE Syria Consortium. They were worried about just not having the funding to provide full rides to refugees. And then also they were worried about politicization that would come from allocating seats. And this was right before Trump's travel ban was about to go into effect. So they were just really concerned about doing something like this. And it's when I attended that Regents meeting and when I spoke to the Regents, I came out feeling disappointed, but also frustrated. And that's what led me to decide to create my own scholarship program and, to gather my community together and do crowdfunding essentially for the scholarship. But once, we were able to establish a scholarship program, and once I had the funds, I think the idea of creating scholarships for refugees in the UC system just seemed a little bit more palpable, I guess. And it wasn't, anymore like this idealistic university students, crazy idea. There was some sort of realization that, wait, we could actually make this happen. And so then that's when I really received a lot of support from my undergraduate campus's financial aid and scholarships office. So I created a scholarship application. They provided me with a ton of feedback on that. They gave me some criteria that I could use to select recipients, and they helped me review the applications. And then when the opportunity presented itself the following year, they told me that the undergraduate campus was actually launching a new initiative through which it would be matching scholarship donations. And so then that's what led me to create a separate fund at the university. So basically I work with that particular UC campus, the University of California, Irvine, to provide scholarships to students at UCI. And then I work with the nonprofit that's holding the funds that I raised. I work with them separately to award scholarships to students at other UCs besides UCI and at California State Universities. And I'm also just continuing to work with the financial aid office. I think having that sort of relationship has been really, really significant. We launched the first ever refugee resource community for students at UCI with a particular focus on supporting asylum seekers who obviously cannot apply for financial aid, federal financial aid or state financial aid in California. So we're trying to consolidate resources geared towards asylum seekers and really just to help the community of displaced students navigate and fund their higher education. And our plan is to soon turn that remote community into a physical space on campus and really create, just a place for these students to come together and to empower them.
I love that so much. I'm processing.
No worries. If there's any gaps, let me know. I'm happy to.
For sure. No, this is so all-encompassing. Like I appreciate that it's not just about finances. It's like a very holistic approach in terms of like matching, like figuring out the needs that were present and matching them financially within the system you were given. That seemed a little challenging at first, and I'm sure still poses a lot of challenges. But in terms of figuring out like that process of figuring out what the need was, how did you go about doing that? Was it a lot of conversations with people who were in these positions where they weren't able to access things? Was it people who already had access and were hoping to share that? Or maybe you heard one person's story and got excited?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold, I guess. I think even before establishing a scholarship program, I heard about the needs, and that's what inspired me to establish a scholarship program. When I was an undergrad, I had started taking Arabic. And then in efforts to practice Arabic outside of the classroom, I connected with refugees online. So there were a lot of different opportunities for that. And there were, just applications on the phone. And then there was also this program called Paper Airplanes, through which I got to mentor a refugee student. And in each conversation that I would have, especially this was around the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, each conversation that I would have, the refugee student would tell me about his or her desire to pursue higher education. And they said this was the sole reason why they were learning English. It's because they couldn't pursue education any longer in their home countries, and they needed to be able to pursue it elsewhere. And so for that reason, they were really trying to increase their English proficiency. And so that's what led me to establish a scholarship program. And then once I started working with the nonprofit, once the scholarship program was there, and other students started reaching out to me, that's when I also learned that there was this community. Essentially, like initially, I was talking to students really outside of the United States. After Trump's travel ban, I was like, I'm very limited to students here. And after creating a scholarship program, I realized that there was a local community of refugee students who were aspiring to go to college that I could work with. So some of it came before and some of it came after the program was established.
That makes total sense. I love that you mentioned Paper Airplanes. Are my organization at school, separate from UAR, just started a partnership with them. I haven't been able to volunteer, like do any work with them yet, but I've heard great things.
It was great. Yeah, I got to speak to a student in Turkey, so that was really cool. And just like we would, talk once a week and just like discuss life in both languages. Yeah, English and Arabic.
I love that. I'm also in Arabic at my university, so I appreciate that your work. Yeah, you work to get that practice in. That sounds excellent, and that makes complete sense about the travel ban limiting your network abroad and ideas about connecting with people abroad. So domestic populations make sense. So you've mentioned one organization, Paper Airplanes, and I remember you mentioning Books Not Bombs at the conference a few weekends ago. And I was wondering if you had like pretty established relationships with external organizations, be it Books Not Bombs or Paper Airplanes or something else, or if that felt more of like you just got a little input and then moved on with your own thing, or if you had reciprocal relationships with any organizations, and if you'd recommend that to someone trying to work through these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Books Not Bombs is a nationwide student-run campaign. I don't think it's too active anymore. I mean, it might become more active now with the change of administration, but it was essentially a campaign through which students would call on their universities to join the IIE Syria Consortium, which I was talking about earlier. And so students would like work to create petitions and pass resolutions with their student governments, calling on their universities to join that consortium. And I actually received a lot of support from the former heads of that campaign. For example, they reviewed the resolution that I wrote up. We would do check-ins before the fundraising dinner just to make sure I was on track. So it was just really great having their support. And even after the fundraising dinner, they actually reached out to media networks to help media pick up on my story and the initiative that I started, which was really great. And I think as far as like you were talking about like the reciprocal relationships, I think what my example showed them and what showed other universities that were part of the Books Not Bombs campaign was that even for universities that aren't so willing to join the IIE Syria Consortium, there is another option. And I think my example kind of showed that there's ways that even if, for example, the university is not willing to create scholarships, or for example, the student body isn't willing to support, and that was the case at my university. Our campus was very, very divided. There were students who were, very against creating scholarships for refugees on my campus. Once I passed the resolution with my student government, they were very, very strongly opposed to it. I remember that even the night of the refugee banquet, the Refugee Student Scholarship Program banquet, they held an anti-refugee event the same day, and like right next door, which was very unfortunate for the community members. It was very frustrating. So I think because, no, sorry, go ahead.
I just did not expect that.
This was 2017. This was like, there was just so much anti-refugee, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and so yeah, I think normally even from the Books Not Bombs campaign's perspective, it kind of seemed like a lost cause, seeing that, look, you don't have the student body support. The university doesn't seem like they're willing to support, before the banquet. But then I kind of showed them that if a student or a group of students still takes initiative and tries to crowdfund, once that program ends up being successful, then you'll find that, more students will reach out to you. And now I have that amazing relationship with the financial aid office. That all came about because we just pushed through that period of uncertainty. And I think after that, we were able to just really build these connections that allowed us to, create the scholarship program that's been successful. And I don't know if I mentioned, but we've awarded 15 scholarships so far. So it's been, it's just incredible. I think the best part is just hearing about these student stories. And Olivia, I don't think I mentioned to you, but when I was an undergrad, I was part of a student organization called Peaceful Passions. And what's amazing now is that that student organization is now run by recipients of the scholarship program, which just goes to show that if you just, provide a little bit of support to these students, they're looking for ways to give back, and they do so immediately.
I was going to ask if you've seen like an increase in student support for the scholarship program, or if there are specific like ways that a student group has been supportive of your efforts, or if you have like students on the ground, whether or not they're recipients, but sort of campus leaders that are doing that work as students, or it's mostly like you as an organization externally working with the university.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think just going off a little bit more about Peaceful Passion. So that was a student organization that I co-founded just to raise awareness and create opportunities for refugees. And so when I was a senior at UC Irvine, I held the scholarship program fundraising dinner as president of Peaceful Passions. And then we received a lot of support from student volunteers. And of course, without their support, the banquet wouldn't have been possible or successful, right? And then we held two annual refugee awareness weeks, which was just an excellent way to create an environment, I think, that's welcoming to refugees. One of the events that we did was a social in which students at UC Irvine were able to actually meet refugees and refugee families and other aspiring refugee college students. And I think it kind of showed them that this isn't a problem that's happening elsewhere in the world. Like, we have refugees in our community, and we should, work to build relationships with them. So I think it was just a really great way to raise awareness. And like I said, it was a great way to create an environment before the refugee students were, ultimately awarded scholarships through the program. And I, I think that the reason I kept the refugee student scholarship program ultimately separate from Peaceful Passions, the campus organization, was just primarily because there's so much turnover in campus organizations. And so some years Peaceful Passions has been more active. Other years it's just, there's really been few students that have been involved. And so just for the sake of sustainability and also accountability, because we're working with donors' funds, I thought it would just be more practical to establish the scholarship program separately and to have members of the scholarship committee be people from the financial aid office, for instance, or members of the nonprofit that's holding most of the funds, and myself, versus having it be run entirely by students just because of that turnover. But I think having an awareness educational component that's student run, I think, has been very impactful. Just a couple weeks ago, there were a few members from the Refugee Student Scholarship Program who were like recipients of the scholarship, who spoke at a panel led by the nonprofit at a summit on SDGs with the UN SDGs, that was led entirely by youth. It was a global event. It was just incredible. So I think students really ought to take the lead and have the ability to take the lead when it comes to the educational component, and can obviously take the lead as far as fundraising. But I think just for the sake of, like I said, transparency, accountability, it was helpful to keep the funds with a separate nonprofit that has a good reputation.
I think that makes complete sense. That was really good for me to hear because I am like trying to do all of this through the student group that I will be leaving in a year.
Right.
And what happens.
And you don't know what's exactly. And if you feel like you want to be involved even after graduating, then I think it's better to have, you can have a little bit of both, like I said, an awareness component, but then keep the scholarship somewhere separate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So then I've been hearing a lot from World University Services Canada and Project Habesha about how they have like their student committees try and be helpful in creating a welcoming campus, like you were saying about having Refugee Awareness Week, creating spaces that ensure that there's a community that is supportive of these initiatives. Are there any specific it doesn't sound like there's any specific mentorship or that kind of thing for recipient students, but are there mechanisms in place at these schools to support students mentally and emotionally? Or have you seen, as you speak with recipient students, have you seen a need for more emotional support and academics, not just financial?
Yeah, definitely. So one way that we've tried to provide that kind of support and resources is through the refugee resource community, but that is limited to the University of California, Irvine, admittedly, and isn't as, and I think part of the reason obviously is because I am an alumna of that school. A lot of the recipients that I've ultimately connected with are actually attending UC Irvine, but there are a few at other UCs and Cal States. So I do hope to be able to also loop them in when we work towards creating this community. But for now, as far as the refugee resource community and the work that we've done there, we've done a needs assessment. So we reached out to them and had them fill out a survey. And it still looks like the primary need that all of them express is financial. After tuition, it's like books and housing. And obviously this is limited to the pool in Southern California. But their primary need was financial. After that, some of them express need as far as mental health. And to be able to provide that, I am going to have further conversations with UC Irvine to see if their counselors could provide more mental health services geared towards this population. But until then, I am working with the nonprofit that's holding most of the funds to be able to do that, because that nonprofit, it's called Access California Services, and they primarily serve refugee populations. And one of the main services they provide is mental health counseling for free. So I planning to work with them, and at least in that resource guide that we compile, just to be able to have that listing in there, I think will be helpful. And in fact, the Office of Financial Aid has offered themselves to provide free one-on-one counseling, financial aid counseling to these students, which I think is just really amazing to be able to, answer their questions about, like, how can I apply for FAFSA? Because obviously refugees and asylees can't apply for FAFSA, so they can get support that way. And they can, it'll just map them through their entire financial aid process. And then some of them mentioned that they're interested in finding ways to get internships and just career development. And so we're planning to consolidate places that are willing to accept students regardless of their immigration status, especially those on campus. And I know from their career goals, because I've read their applications, most of them are aspiring doctors and lawyers. That's pretty much, or like PAs. So they're either in the medical field or in the legal field. So we're going to be compiling internship opportunities geared towards those careers. And unfortunately, a handful of them mentioned food insecurity. And so again, we're going to be doing nonprofit referrals. And then there's also a food bank on campus that we're going to be having conversations with to make sure that this population is served. That's pretty much it, as far as like the different categories that they express needs in.
That's amazing. That's so good to hear that it sounds like you have your fingers on the pulse of things in a really great way that, organizations don't always seem to have. And so this is just so impressive how much material you have for being such a young organization. And so I'm really impressed by this. And I'd love to hear a bit. I know you mentioned the refugee resource community twice now, and I have it in my notes twice now, but I'd love to hear just like if you could give a quick summary or breakdown of how you put that together and who facilitates that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, once, as I mentioned, once we were able to establish that connection with the Office of Financial Aid and the scholarships at UCI, in fact, one of the financial aid coordinators at that office themselves reached out to me and had this idea. So it was just incredible to see that, they took the initiative and they reached out to me and they wanted this to happen. So once they pitched the idea, I was just really ecstatic, really excited to support something like this. And I think one of our goals is, like I said, to turn it in from like this virtual remote community into an actual physical space. And we're thinking of perhaps making it like a wing of the Dream Center that we have for undocumented students. Because I think just having the kind of the support and community that they have for the undocumented students and the kinds of programs and social events that they hold, I think are just really incredible. And in many ways, it's a good model, I think, for us as we're trying to launch similar initiatives for students forcibly displaced by conflict.
Absolutely. I think I really only have one more question. I mean, personally, I have a lot of questions, but I think for our purposes, the next question I have is about longevity, because you said you have been, I hope this doesn't make your heart speed up sometimes. Finding funding stresses me out. But I know that you said that you're still using the $100,000 raised at the initial gala. Hopefully that doesn't run out anytime soon. But thinking about the future of the organization, is that something that I know you're hoping to, is that something you've thought a lot about, made plans for, or just that's in your mind somewhere?
That's a great question. And in fact, I remember when I first, when we first raised close to 100,000, in my mind, I thought that was going to be exhausted in a year, because our thought was, $10,000. What's that, like 10 students? Yeah. I thought it would be exhausted. But I think what's really great is knowing that because refugees and asylees actually can apply for federal financial aid, they are able to do that. And many of them, we actually get some applications where we look at the students and we ask them for a return or whatever it's called. I'm like talking in tax terms, but like a screenshot or printout of what they're getting from federal aid. And when we look at that, we see that they're already completely covered sometimes. And so sometimes they are, and it's great. And sometimes they get loans and we try to minimize those loans. But like I said, asylum seekers are the ones who aren't going to get anything. And because we've been focusing on asylum seekers, we're able to sometimes award the refugees and asylees like around 1,500 or 2,000 just to cover that small remaining need that they have after they've already received the federal financial aid. So I think just, seeing the numbers, even a small amount, and this is to all the students out there who are thinking about crowdfunding, even if you decide to do that path just because you don't feel like it's viable to do a referendum on your campus or to get your university to allocate funding or seats themselves, crowdfunding isn't a lost cause. And if you even raise like 5,000, 10,000, that can have more of an impact than you think, in terms of supporting these students.
That's so great to hear. And I appreciate
So as far as exhausting the funds, so the plan is, once it's close to being exhausted, just to do another round of fundraising, and perhaps maybe having conversations with the universities again, just to show them like, look, these are some of the incredible students in your student body that were able to attend. Isn't this something that you want to be able to support yourselves? So I think I'm going to have that conversation again with them. And now I actually have like some stories to present to them. And I'm sure some of these recipients themselves will want to go and share their stories. I think they've just been really incredible in wanting to advocate for other refugee students. So I think just presenting these stories to them will open up those conversations again. And if not, I do think that my university is less divided than it was in 2017. Fortunately, a lot of those divisive students graduated. So I guess another plan is like to consider maybe like the WISC model in Canada and maybe do some sort of referendum through which each student pledges $1 or $2 more to their tuition. And all the students collectively then can finance the tuition of a refugee student.
And I'm hoping you can help us answer this over the course of the next couple months as we put together our guidelines. But if you have like 2 or 3 pieces of advice for folks just getting started with this kind of thing, you mentioned the value of crowdfunding and not underestimating that. But if you have, any pieces of advice based on, now looking back, if you would have done anything differently, or if you didn't realize how important something was that you were doing in the moment, I think those could be really valuable.
Sure. I think one thing looking back, I would, even though I feel like I did as best as I could as a 20-year-old at the time, kind of gauging the needs of these students, I think I should have done more research into seeing exactly which populations weren't being served. And I know I've been stressing that a lot in this conversation, but it's really the asylum seekers that have absolutely no support. And it's frustrating because I think even in California, for example, we do have options for undocumented students. They can qualify for state aid, but asylum seekers can't even qualify for that. And I think with the huge backlog that we have in immigration courts right now, families could be waiting years upon years with their asylum status pending. And I think we need to be able to support the students whose status is pending and who want to be able to go and pursue higher education while they're waiting, right? And so I think tailoring my scholarship more towards asylum seekers would have been good. But I think even generally calling it the Refugee Student Scholarship Program has been fine too. It is a generic term. And I think that was part of the reason was because, if they Google it, they'll see it, right?
Yeah.
So I think in hindsight, I just wish I gave it a little bit more focus, but I don't think it's too late. And so I've been, this is something that you should constantly, especially if you want to be involved in something like this, be willing to constantly do more research and being at the forefront of these kinds of initiatives. Okay, another piece of advice. I would say, wow, that's tough. Okay, yeah, obviously the one that you gather, thank you, which was, don't underestimate yourself as a college student. You can have much more of an impact than you believe. And even if all seems lost, even if you feel like there's no hope, there's always a way out. And for me, that was crowdfunding. But
I underestimated crowdfunding. Like going into this, this whole time have been like, that's like a one-time thing that she was able to pull together because she's amazing. But I don't know that that's like actually applicable. But it does,
Yeah, it's doable. Like I said, it's not the easiest way. Number one way is get the university to do it. And I think now we have more examples than we did before, especially with Columbia. Be like, look, Columbia did this. Look at how they did it. And they made it. And if you look at their application, it's very convincing too. Like they map you through like why exactly it is that universities need to support this. Right. So I think number one, get the university to do it. And if not, try to see if students collectively can do it. But worst case, crowdfunding has a lot of benefits too, because like I said, we were able to bring the whole community together. And at the event, we were able to invite speakers who spoke about, she was part of the program, the Scholars at Risk. So she was a scholar that, was UC Irvine was supporting. So she talked about her experience and the experience of her students in Syria. And then one other element that we had was that we actually invited prospective applicants to the program to attend the fundraising dinner. And they came and they connected with donors and they told them their stories. And each table kind of had conversations with these students. And I think, like, when do you get to go to a fundraising dinner where you actually get to meet the students you'll be able to support, right? Like, you never meet that population. So it was just a really beautiful event.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and it was great for awareness, which is so important, right? We can't, and that's, I guess, another piece of advice, like, don't underestimate awareness. That's the first step towards action.